Hi, OpenXML developers. Today I'm going to discuss the issue of keeping metadata with content items in OpenXML word processing ML. This is the idea that we want to store some metadata with paragraphs. We may want to store metadata with tables. We may even want to store metadata with the rows and cells in those tables and also with the paragraphs in those tables. And we also may want to associate metadata with numbered lists or bulleted lists and the list items in those lists. This is a bit of a sticky problem. It's a problem that I've been grappling with literally for years. Recently, I was talking with Jan Urbanski and Ken Stern of Spectra Global Solutions. They were describing their need to keep metadata with content items. And through this collaboration, we came up with an interesting approach whereby you can keep metadata with content items in an OpenXML word processing ML document. And further, after you put this metadata with these content items, you can enable your end users to edit that document to their heart's content. And after they have edited that document, we can still understand exactly what is the metadata for each content item. And this includes taking into consideration the interesting edge cases around this, that if the user deletes a paragraph entirely, then that means that the paragraph is deleted and the metadata is effectively deleted. And if the user inserts a new paragraph, we need to know that that paragraph was inserted and that there is no metadata for that paragraph. And of course, if the user copies and pastes or cuts and pastes or moves content within the document, the metadata associated with those content items should move with those content items. So there are 6 varieties of content items for which we want to keep metadata. Let's take them one at a time and talk about them. Well, first and foremost is that we want to keep metadata with a paragraph. So, for example, here we have a document, and this document has a number of paragraphs. Of course, I'm using artificial example content here, but let's say that some of this content comes from databases or comes from web services or other sources of information, and you want to notate where this content came from. And after the user edits this document, you might want to go back and update that data source with the modified content. So for instance, the user may come up here, they select this paragraph, and there is some metadata associated with this paragraph, and they cut that paragraph, and they come down here, and they paste the paragraph down there. We should be able to understand that this paragraph right here, video proves a powerful way to help you prove your point, has the same metadata that it had before we cut and pasted that paragraph. We also want to consider the idea of associating metadata with tables. Another case that is interesting and really important is when we copy and paste or cut and paste a table, an entire table. You might have metadata for this table that indicates the database table that this word processing table came from, and you might enable your end user to open up the document and they can see the data that got pulled from that database table. And if the user modifies this document in some particular way, you very well may want to update that underlying database table. So the user could come in here and they can select the entire table and click delete that table and insert the table down here. And you want to know that this is in fact the same table, even though the end user cut and pasted that table from one location to another in the document. Within tables, we also very well may want to associate metadata with rows. you may want to enable your end user to come over here and cut this row from their table, and then come down here and insert that content as a new row. And in this case, even though this row started further up in the table, we want to maintain that metadata associated with that row. If you happen to need to associate metadata with cells in that row, you also want to have that metadata follow those cells from where they were cut and to where they were pasted. And of course, it follows that all of those paragraphs in those cells, they might have metadata, and you want to move that metadata with those paragraphs. And last but not least, you may want to associate metadata with lists and list items. So for instance, let's say that you've associated metadata with every single item in this list, and if the end user comes up here and deletes this item and pastes it in down here, even though the item number changed, you want to retain the identity of that list item and therefore also retain the metadata associated with that list item. Even more to the point, you may want to enable the end user to select the entire list, cut it, come to some other location in the document and paste it, and the metadata that is associated with this entire list, in other words, the set of items 1 through 6, that metadata should follow that list. This, in a nutshell, is the problem. The scenario is that as a systems designer, you may want to pull information from an underlying database or other data source. You may then want to construct a document from that data. You then want to annotate all of the various parts of the document. You want to associate metadata with paragraphs, with tables, with numbered lists, and so on. You want to enable your end user to edit this document to their heart's content. And after they've edited the document, you want to be able to process that document and optionally, based on the workflow of your particular application and your particular user scenario, optionally update the underlying database or data source. Well, as such, there is no way to store metadata in word processing ML. We can insert content controls, and we can, in some senses, store metadata associated with those content controls. There are means by which we can do that, but this has limitations. One limitation is that content controls make for a more cumbersome editing experience. If the user wants to be cutting and pasting and copying and pasting content controls, it's not anywhere near as intuitive as the user just copying, pasting, and cutting and pasting paragraphs and tables and rows within those tables. And the second reason you may not want to use content controls is it adds this whole layer over top of your underlying structured data. Your structured data may have a very close parallel to the content in a word processing document. You might have numbered lists, you might have paragraphs, you might have styling in those paragraphs, you might have tables, you might have content in the tables, you may even have embedded tables. And in all of these cases, pulling content controls into the mix is not the best approach. There are places where content controls have no equal. They're the absolute best solution to solving things like forms and enabling the end user to fill out forms in their document. But if you want to enable your end user just to edit structured data that you're pulling from some data source and then constructing a document, content controls become a bit cumbersome to use. Well, there is an approach that we can use to associate metadata with all of these content items. I've been considering this problem for quite some time, and it wasn't until my conversations with Yen and Ken that a good solution occurred to me. Let's talk through what that solution is. So the question is, how can we associate this metadata? And what I've come up with is an approach where we do two things. First of all, we insert some field codes at the beginning of every single paragraph in the document. Second of all, we turn on revision tracking, and even more, we actually enforce that revision tracking be turned on. We restrict editing in the document such that the end user must continue to track revisions. And then we have a little module called Identity Manager, which is part of Power Tools for OpenXML. This module, the Identity Manager module, goes into a document that has these field codes inserted and has revision tracking turned on, and it's able to process all of that markup and reestablish identity for every single item in the list. And because we have reestablished identity in that fashion, that means any metadata associated with each content item in the document is maintained. If you're not familiar with field codes, there are three key strokes that you need to be familiar with regards to field codes. One keystroke is Alt F9. When I press Alt F9, it shows all of the field codes in the document in their field code form. Some field codes have representations that you can see in the document. So for instance, if you have a date type field code, then when you are looking at the field code in the form where you don't see the instructions of the field code, you'll see the current date. So Alt F9 toggles the entire document between showing the instructions for every field code and showing the representation of the field code. Now, in this particular case, we're using the comments type field code, and we're putting a little argument on those comments field code. This argument is an index, and I'll talk about what that's for in just a bit. So in this particular approach, what we're going to do is we're going to insert a field code at the beginning of every paragraph, and we're going to use the comments field code type for this approach, although there's nothing to restrict it to the comments field code type. There are custom field code types in the OpenXML standards. So for instance, I could, instead of using the word comment here, I could have anything else here. I could have, for instance, IM here and call this the IM type field code, short for Identity Manager. But in this particular case, I used the comments type of a field code. So Alt F9 toggles showing field codes for the entire document and not showing field codes for the document. The other two keystrokes that you need to be aware of is Shift F9 toggles and shows a particular field code. So you don't use that as often, but it's there. I generally tend to either be showing all field codes or showing no field codes. And then finally, Control F9 enables me to insert a field code. So for instance, I can put the date field code in there, and I can press Update. And now if I press Alt F9, I'll see that it actually has today's current date in there. That's what field codes are about. Now, we're using field codes, but the use of field codes here, we're intending this use to be completely invisible to the end user. And let me explain how we're going to go about that. I'll delete that date field code. And now I'm going to toggle field codes off. Further, I have this document set up to restrict editing. If I look down here, I'm going to restrict the permission to only allow this type of editing in the document, which is tracked changes, and I'll say yes, start enforcing protection. I won't put a password on for right now. It doesn't really matter. Whether you put a password on or not doesn't affect the behavior of this. Now I'm going to come up here and I am going to cut this paragraph from there, and I'm going to paste it in right there. And now let's see, if I show all field codes, I can find out that up here at the top, this field code is comments 1, and it was marked as move from. This is the notation. This green with a double strike through it is the notation for move from. And that comment field code got moved from that location and got inserted at this location further down in the document. And so from that, from the markup of revision tracking and from the markup of those field codes, the identity manager can post-process this and can know that this particular paragraph was cut from this location up here and pasted at this location down here, and therefore it can maintain the metadata associated with that content item. Now, that's interesting to have a unique integer associated with each content item, but that doesn't really enable us to maintain all the metadata that we want to associate with that content item. So what we can do is we can put all of our metadata into a custom XML part and index it by this field code index, or this field code ID that we see on each one of these comments field codes. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to look at that document that we were just looking at in the Open XML Package Editor Power Tool for Visual Studio 2010. I'll drag and drop that document onto Visual Studio 2010. And you can see that this document does have a custom XML part. Just for our own information, let's look at the main document part first. I'll format the XML. And here we can see the field code. We can see that there is a field code here with the field char with a field char type of begin. And there is the instructions for that field code. It has comments 1 in there. And down here we have the field char type of end. So that comprises the field code. And this argument 1 up here that we saw in the document when we were editing it, that refers to XML in the custom XML part. So let's open up that and sort it. So here what we can see is there is XML that has this root element of identity manager, and then it has an F element for every single field code in that document, and it has an ID, and this ID matches up to that ID on the field code. And here we can see that there is this content item as denoted by this I element, and this content item is a paragraph, and it has a content item ID of 1. This U down here is a unique ID for every content item. You can have just about anything you want inside of this unique ID. Further, you can put any additional XML as a child of this I element that you want to. So let's say that I come in here and I'll terminate that XML item, and I'll put in a new element in there. So I put any arbitrary XML as a child element of that I element, and let's save it. So this is 00 test source.docx. Now I'm going to run the identity manager over that document. This document has those field codes in it. It has revision tracking in it, and it has that custom XML part with all of that content in it, that custom XML that contains the identity and metadata of every content item in the document. I'll run the identity manager over that document. It also ran over all of those other documents in that same folder, but we don't really care about that right now. Let's look at the processed version of that document. This is the document that after it has been processed by Identity Manager. If we go into the main document part, we'll see all of our field codes in there. We can see up at the top here that now the first field code in the document is this comments 2, because the comments 1 paragraph has been cut and pasted further on in the document. We see comments 3, and down here we can see comments 1. This is the paragraph that we cut and pasted. And if we were to go into the custom XML part, we can still see that our custom XML has maintained the identity of that content item, and further, it has maintained the metadata that we stored about that content item. Now that paragraph has moved further on in the document, and yet it still points to this content item with an identity of 1, and it has our metadata of test data. So the key point in this first video, this part 1 of this 2-part video series, is that we're now able to associate custom metadata with any content item in a document, including paragraphs, tables, rows, cells, lists, or list items, and we're able to enable our end users to edit that document, and then we're able to understand exactly what edits happened and to see the metadata move with that particular content item to its new location. That's enough for this video. This is the main point I wanted to convey in this video. In the next video, I'm going to first show you a tool that you can use to see the metadata associated with each content item in a much easier fashion. And then I'm going to work through various examples. I'm going to show you that through all the varieties of editing operations that an end user might take on a document, we can always keep identity of every single item in that document and maintain the metadata associated with each item in that document. See you in that video.